Okay, well, I'm recording this on October 27th, probably releasing this on the 28th, but this is the one-year anniversary of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, where 11 people were murdered. I believe 6 were injured. And this was the worst attack on the Jewish community in American history, I believe. And the timing of this episode is fortuitous because I am speaking with Bari Weiss about her new book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. And Bari is a staff writer and editor for the opinion section at the New York Times. She was also an op-ed and book review editor at the Wall Street Journal before that. She has worked at Tablet, the online magazine of Jewish politics and culture, and she is a native of Pittsburgh and in fact was a bat mitzvah at the Tree of Life Synagogue and knew people who were killed, as you'll hear. So this is a timely conversation, and Bari and I cover a fair amount of ground here. We talk about the different strands of anti-Semitism, right-wing, left-wing, and Islamic. We talk about the difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, which was a point that only became clear to me in reading Bari's book. We talk about the so-called Great Replacement theory among white supremacists, the populist response to globalization, the history of anti-Semitism in the U.S., its theological roots, criticisms of Israel, the fate of the Jews in Western Europe, and other topics. I'll have a few more things to say about all this in my afterword, but now without further delay, I bring you Bari Weiss. I am here with Bari Weiss. Bari, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So you have written a book that's not going to be controversial at all. This has to be fun for you. I know this is already out and launched and reviewed, and you're well into your book tour, or maybe somewhere near the end of it, or maybe the book tour is going to subsume the rest of your life. But
it feels like that at the moment.
Yeah, the book is How to Fight Anti-Semitism, and it is a great and bracing read. It's a short book. This is one of these books that you really can start and finish with confidence, which is nice. We want to talk about this in great depth, the topic of anti-Semitism. But before we do, I just want to get some context for you and your work as a journalist and as an opinion person. How would you describe your politics and your career thus far as a journalist?
Well, if you Google me, you'll get one answer, which is that I'm apparently extremely controversial. My answer is that I'm fairly boring. I am very socially liberal. I'm sort of hawkish on foreign policy. I consider myself left of center, but I think, like many people who are similarly positioned, we're a bit politically homeless at the moment, so we sort of don't fit into either of the increasingly extreme tribes, and therefore are sort of seized upon and pilloried by both of them. You know, just for some background, I spent 6 or 7 years at the Wall Street Journal in 2 stints, first as an op-ed editor on the editorial page, and then as a book review editor, both of which were under the umbrella of the editorial page, which is, of course, famously, I would say, free market conservative place. And I was always the most left-wing person in that milieu. Then I moved after Trump became a candidate, and I didn't want to be a part of an editorial page that was in some way apologizing for or kind of quietly supporting him or covering for him. I left along with many people, including Bret Stephens, who's now my colleague at the New York Times, and I went from being sort of the most left-wing person at the Journal's editorial page to one of the most, I guess, right-wing people at the New York Times. So that sort of, I think, concisely sums it up a little bit.
Yeah. So needless to say, you are often maligned as a Nazi or Nazi adjacent, and I know the feeling. And we perhaps we'll get into that, but let's talk about the genesis of the book, because I believe you began writing this book after the synagogue atrocity in Pittsburgh, which landed all too close to home. Perhaps summarize what happened there for those who have forgotten.
Right. There have been so many since then. On the morning of October 27th, 2018, a white supremacist walked into Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, which is the neighborhood of Pittsburgh where I was raised. Tree of Life was the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah. And he walked in, he shouted that all Jews must die, and then he murdered 11 people there on Shabbat, Saturday morning. I was in Arizona at the time. I got a text from my youngest sister on our family chat, and she simply said, there's a shooter at Tree of Life. I immediately thought of my dad, who often goes to synagogue at one of the different services that meets there on Saturday morning. There are 3 communities that meet in that building. And I immediately typed back, is Dad? I didn't even finish the question. Thank God he wasn't there. He was still at home with my mom. But my mom wrote back, we're going to know a lot of people there. And my dad knew 6 or 7 of the people that were killed. I knew 2. I was supposed to fly to Israel, of all places, the following day to do a reporting trip on a very famous archaeological dig in Jerusalem called the City of David. I put off the trip. I went home for the week, and I just sort of immersed myself in what happens to a community and a community you know so well in the aftermath of something like this, and wrote several columns. I was on Bill Maher that Friday night, and I actually was under contract to write a different book, one that I'm still on the hook for, sort of about our culture wars, but found myself just drawn back again and again to this topic and just sort of seeing it everywhere I looked. And so I sort of went hat in hand to my publisher and asked if I could do this quickly first, and if we could get it out before the Jewish high holidays, which somehow we managed to do.
Well, you do a few very useful things in the book, and one of which is to differentiate the 3 poles of anti-Semitism, the right wing, the left wing, and the Islamic. I think we'll find as we speak about these things that the latter 2 interact in ways that are so cynical and sinister on the Islamic side, and so phantasmagorically stupid and masochistic on the left-wing side that, honestly, it's very hard to understand how that alliance is even possible. But when we talk about this, I think the left-wing and the Islamist problem will become sort of braided. You also make a point which I hadn't really seen made before, which is that one of the reasons why the Jews are so often attacked from the left and the right and elsewhere is that on the right they are considered non-white or insufficiently white and yet able to pass for white in this kind of sinister way. And on the left, if anything, they are extra white. They somehow have extra privilege and the least points in the intersectionality Olympics. Perhaps we should start with the right wing side, because that's sort of the cleanest to talk about, and this obviously is most relevant to what happened in Pittsburgh. Did I describe the way you differentiate these things accurately?
Yeah, I had written a column. There was a survey or a study that came out that was very shocking last year about the prevalence of anti-Semitism in Europe. From, I believe CNN did it, and I wrote a column laying out this, what I described at the time as sort of a 3-headed dragon. I used that same structure in the book, but frankly, if I'm honest, I had hoped to avoid the chapter on Islam for all of the reasons that I think we'll get into, but are probably already obvious to anyone who listens to your show and sees the way that your ideas get talked about, that it's a very scary topic to write about. And I had honestly hoped to avoid it, and then realized that it would be the most intellectually dishonest thing to write a book about anti-Semitism and not talk about it.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's start with the cleanest case, which is the extreme right. And you make a point in the book that I really had never considered, and it explains a lot, which is that anti-Semitism really is not just another flavor of racism on the right. I won't put the words in your mouth, but how is the white supremacist hatred of Jews different from their hatred of other groups?
So, and there's an anti-racist activist called Eric Ward who runs the Western States Center. And his essay, which is called Skin in the Game, I really recommend it to people, was illuminating to me and helped inform my thinking on this. So what he says is that when I heard, and maybe you're similar, When I saw the marchers in Charlottesville shouting, "Jews will not replace us," I heard that originally in a very straightforward way. I heard it as, a Jew is not going to take my place in the corner office. A Jew is not going to take my status in society, something along those lines. But I realized in reading Eric Ward's work and others that that's not what they were saying at all. What they were suggesting is that Jews, in a way, and this is Eric Ward's language, they're in a way the greatest trick the devil has ever played. And the reason for that is because, at least in America, this is not true in Israel, where the majority of Jews are of Mizrahi descent, so they're of North African and Middle Eastern descent. In America, the majority of Jews are of Eastern European or Ashkenazi descent. 15% of American Jews are Jews of color by the most liberal estimate. So we appear to be white, and we can pass as white. And so we trick real white people into thinking that we're like them. But in fact, we're loyal to black people and brown people and immigrants and Muslims. And if you go and you read, you could see them as deranged, or you could see it as a kind of, conspiracy theory when you read the social media postings of the killer in Pittsburgh, right? The reason that he chose Tree of Life as the synagogue is that the previous weekend, the previous Shabbat, Tree of Life had participated in what was called National Refugee Shabbat, in which dozens of synagogues around the country came together to say, we are safe spaces. I hate that language, but we are places that are open to the stranger. And the reason that we are is that one of the core Jewish values is the idea that we should never oppress a stranger because we know what it was to be strangers in the land of Egypt. And that whole initiative was put together by a very, very admirable, righteous organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, founded in the 1880s to help settle Jews fleeing Eastern European pogroms, and now helps Jewish refugees, but all kinds of refugees and immigrants around the world. And he said in his social media postings, and there's lots of expletives, but something along the lines of, screw your optics, I'm going in. These people are bringing in, they're sullying the country by bringing in the, quote, dirty Muslims. So that is the logic behind it. So Jews are kind of the linchpin, in a way, of white supremacist thinking, because we're the kind of shadow force, being the handmaidens of the people that white supremacists see as sullying white Christian America, if that makes sense.
Well, unfortunately, there's very often a kernel of truth embedded in these conspiracy theories. And the kernel of truth here is that, of course, Jews have historically had a very positive attitude towards civil rights and been very supportive of civil rights in the U.S. And through hard experience learned the consequences of being the victims of jingoistic immigration restrictions. I mean, the most probably shocking case is what happened in 1939 with the SS St. Louis. This was a ship that was carrying over 900 Jews who were seeking to escape the Holocaust, and it was denied entry in the U.S. It was also denied entry in Cuba and Canada, and wound up having to return to Europe, where many of these Jews ended up in Auschwitz. Experiences like that would explain, apart from just basic human decency around the general problem of refugees, that would explain a positive orientation toward immigration that, if you're a white supremacist, you would revile. So we could sort of run to the same thing here on the right with the association between Jews and socialism and communism. There have been, very prominent Jews who were supportive of those political movements, and it's kind of a perfect storm of populism and isolationism and conspiracy thinking, that's been fed for more than a century with notions born of fake literature like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it culminates now in what you refer to as the Great Replacement Theory, which perhaps you want to summarize. The right is organized around a kind of an anti-globalist inward turn into nationalism and jingoism and isolationism, and Jews are on the wrong side of that divide.